Overall, my opinion, I thought this was a very smart, calculated, and purposeful draft by the Miami Dolphins. There weren't any standout moments in which the fans or any of us got really excited and overwhelmed with star power. None of these picks elicited that type of reaction. But what you can say from a very practical, straightforward, unbiased standpoint is that the Dolphins drafted logically, and they did so by addressing many different needs. They might say they picked best player available because every GM says that, and Chris Greer is known to say, oh, no, we went with the best player available. And even on Friday night after the Raekwon McMillan selection, everybody asked, hey, was that the best player available or the best linebacker available? He goes, no, best player available. So they're going to say that. But in reality, in my opinion, they picked the players who they deem to be the best available at their respective positions. That's the way this worked out from my vantage point. And those positions were of great need for the Dolphins, so it's not a bad thing. Defensive end, linebacker, cornerback, offensive guard. They doubled down on defensive tackles. The only position of need that wasn't addressed was safety, and the only pick that didn't fill a need was Isaiah Ford in the 7th round, but it's a 7th round. And Chris Greer had a higher grade on Ford and couldn't resist the value that he provided there. And, I have no problem in the 7th round if you decide that, hey, literally best player available there, go for it. None of these drafts, none of them, for the Dolphins or otherwise, can be truly evaluated for at least 2 years and probably longer. 3 years is probably the rule of thumb and maybe even beyond that. So it's not going to be fair for me to say that this draft is a definite home run or a complete failure. I don't think that's fair for me or anybody else to say. It's way too early in the process. However, had the Dolphins addressed a bunch of positions in which they didn't have needs, or if they drafted a bunch of players with major character concerns, then I think they would have opened themselves up to deserved skepticism and criticism. I could have come on here this morning and blasted them if they picked a bunch of Joe Mixons throughout the draft, or if they decided, hey, let's add 2 wide receivers and a running back with their first 4 picks, right? I mean, they don't have those needs on the roster like they desperately do on the defensive side of the ball. But in my mind, the Dolphins had a very solid, though perhaps unspectacular, but very solid 2017 draft. You can nitpick whether you would have preferred a different pass rusher or linebacker or cornerback or offensive guard or interior defensive lineman, but at the end of the day, they addressed those positions of need, which is a major positive in my book. And who are we to say that they didn't pick the appropriate players at these positions? Because that's the one criticism that I've seen so far from Dolphins fans. It's, I would have preferred this linebacker, or I would have preferred this defensive end, or this offensive guard. I mean, Mike Tannenbaum, Chris Greer, Adam Gase, the entire scouting and player personnel departments of the Miami Dolphins do exhaustive research and work with the ultimate goal being to get these decisions absolutely right. We all know it's an inexact science, and we all know you're not going to hit 100% of the time, but the way I look at it is if they targeted Charles Harris a month ago and had that type of conviction that that was the guy that they want, the player, the person, character, production on the field, you can count him off the field, I'm all for it. Who are we to say that they made the wrong decision a few days after the pick was made? Harris, of course, is the headliner. And as with any first-round pick, he's going to have the highest expectations surrounding him. And with every draft, the evaluation begins with how well that first-round pick performs. So when we look back at this 2017 draft, we are going to take a look at Charles Harris first and foremost to determine whether this was a productive draft or whether the Dolphins dropped the ball. And while Harris is not going to start immediately with Cam Wake and Andre Branch understandably ahead of him on the depth chart, he'll be expected to be a major contributor in that defensive end rotation. He needs to get after the quarterback. I say that again. He needs to get after the quarterback. That's what they brought him in for. His quote-unquote weakness against the run, that can be developed. I don't think anybody's going to be overly impatient as he develops that part of his game. But the immediate thing that he can do well is rush the passer and wreak havoc in the backfields of all the opponents this season, and specifically in the AFC East. Tom Brady, Charles Harris, Cam Wake, they're coming for you. Tyrod Taylor, Cam Wake, Charles Harris, in that order, they're coming for you. And whoever the heck is playing quarterback for the Jets, who we still have no idea, well, we're coming for them too. And for everyone that would have preferred Reuben Foster, because I've heard that a lot over the last few days, because that's the guy that many fans have told me, hey, that's who I wanted. I was upset when they picked Harris. I wanted Reuben Foster. He was still available, the Alabama linebacker. Well, we'll have the rest of their respective careers to compare the two, Harris and Foster. And their production will do the evaluation for us, right? I mean, if Harris is a menace on the outside and gets after the quarterback the way we hope he does, then we'll be happy with the pick. If Foster becomes a multiple-time All-Pro and Pro Bowl player, then you might have some regret. If they're both really good, terrific. But if Foster gets his act together and does turn into a significantly better and more productive professional than Harris, then we'll look back and lament this decision by the Dolphins. No doubt about it. And you can look back at those two players, because, again, Foster's the name that I've heard the most that fans really, really wanted and coveted at that 22nd overall pick. But remember this, Foster failed the drug test. Foster was kicked out of the combine. Foster has major injury red flags, and there are questions about his long-term durability because of his tackling style. On the other hand, there are zero character concerns associated with Harris. He spent his time at the combine making a very positive impression on all teams, and obviously the Dolphins. And there aren't any durability or injury red flags. Now, with that being said, he still has to come in and make plays, because ultimately you are judged and will determine whether you're good or bad in terms of the selection if you can produce on the field. As for the day 2 selections of McMillan and Tankersley, let's hope they buck the trend of largely failed second and third round selections in recent years. Since 2009, you may have heard me say this already this week, and I've been on the air a lot, but the Dolphins have selected 18 players in the second or third rounds. Of those 18, just 6 are still on the team. Those 6 are Xavier Howard, Kenyon Drake, Leonte Carew, Jordan Phillips, Koamisi, and Jarvis Landry. No longer with Miami, the list includes Pat White, Sean Smith, Patrick Turner, John Jerry, Daniel Thomas, Jonathan Martin, Olivier Vernon, Michael Agnew, Jamar Taylor, Dallas Thomas, Will Davis, and Billy Turner. Now, a couple of those names have been pretty darn good pros. Like Olivier Vernon had a terrific season and just kind of was outpriced in free agency when he went to the Giants. Sean Smith has had a pretty good career for himself. But a lot of those guys have either bounced around the NFL or are no longer in the National Football League. And I think that speaks volumes to how poorly the Dolphins have drafted on day 2 in recent years. So my point is this. That trend needs to turn around. McMillan and Tankersley need to come in and make an impact long-term for this team. I think it's vitally important for McMillan to come through as a sure-tackling, run-stopping specialist who can be a long-term fixture in the linebacking core. And for Tankersley to eventually become a reliable starter in the secondary. And I say eventually because Chris Greer admitted on Friday night that he is a developing player. And there's a high likelihood, based on everything I've heard, it's been reported now that his time will ultimately come in 2018 rather than this year in 2017 when Byron Maxwell becomes too expensive to keep around. That's the projection. They basically are bringing in one Clemson cornerback to replace another. But Tankersley, in conjunction with this defensive coaching staff, will be expected to have a long-term impact as well, and I think that's very important. The later you get in the draft, the less certainty there is. So, of course, the expectations are lower for Asiata, Godshaw, Taylor, and Ford, but all have intriguing characteristics. In the case of the 5th rounders, Asiata and Godshaw, let's not forget that the Dolphins have picked Jay Ajayi, Rashad Jones, and let's go back even further to Zach Thomas in the 5th round in the past. So by no means have they been perfect in the 5th round. I am excluding a lot of names that haven't worked out very well, but those are examples of players that have come in and made major impacts. Ajayi, we all know about, breakout 1,000-plus yard season, went to the Pro Bowl in his second year in 2016. Rashad Jones has signed a lucrative contract extension because he's been a playmaker out of Georgia. And then Zach Thomas, arguably the best linebacker in franchise history. So there's the possibility you can get some production there. And I do think that you can make an argument that Isaac Asiata has just as good a chance as any of these draft picks to come in and compete for a starting job, because that's what they're expecting from him. He's going to come in and try to push Jermon Bushrod and Ted Larson in that battle for offensive guard. Getting back to the big picture here, as we examine this Dolphins draft as a whole, there weren't any head-scratching moments this year. There was never once where I said, oh my gosh, I can't believe they just did that. And I think that's a sign of a solid, well-thought-out plan that was executed by Chris Grier and his staff. With all that being said, time will tell how history views and how all of us ultimately view the 2017 version of the Dolphins draft. But on the surface, the 7 rounds went into the books. It appears to be a very logical, sound, and purposeful draft for the Miami Dolphins.